The wind howled through the bare branches like hungry wolves as Sarah Chen pressed her face against the cold window of the trading post. Her breath fogged the glass, but she could still see the snow falling in thick sheets across the main street of Bitter Creek. At 17, she had never seen a winter this harsh. The storm had been raging for 3 days now, and the temperature had dropped so low that even the old-timers were shaking their heads in worry. "Girl, get away from that window before you catch your death," growled Marcus Webb from behind the counter. His voice carried the rough edge of a man who had spent 40 years dealing with desperate people in desperate times. Sarah turned to face him, her dark eyes filled with the kind of worry that made her look older than her years. "When do you think Papa will be back?" she asked, wrapping her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. The trading post was warmer than outside, but the old building leaked heat through every crack and gap in the wooden walls. Marcus looked up from his ledger book, his weathered face showing a mixture of sympathy and something else Sarah couldn't quite read. "Hard to say with weather like this. Could be days before anyone can travel the mountain roads." Sarah's father, Chen Wei, had left 5 days ago to deliver a load of furniture to the silver mine up in the hills. He was a skilled carpenter, and his handmade tables and chairs were sought after by the wealthy mine owners who wanted comfort in their rough mountain camps. But 5 days in this weather meant something had gone wrong. "Mr. Webb," Sarah said carefully, "about the money Papa owes you." Marcus Webb's expression grew hard. He was a man who had built his business on credit and collecting debts, and the Chen family owed him more than $200 for supplies they had bought over the past year. In 1887, in a small town like Bitter Creek, that was more money than most families saw in 2 years. "Your father promised to pay when he got back from this delivery," Webb said, his fingers drumming on the wooden counter. "That mine job was supposed to bring in enough to settle the account." Sarah nodded, her stomach tight with worry. She knew the family's financial situation better than her father realized. They had been struggling ever since her mother died of fever the previous spring. Without her mother's income from taking in laundry, they had been forced to buy everything on credit from Webb's store. The door to the trading post burst open, bringing with it a blast of freezing air and swirling snow. Tom Morrison, the town's unofficial messenger, stumbled inside, his mustache white with ice. "Close that door before we all freeze," Webb barked. Morrison slammed the door shut and stamped his feet, shaking snow from his heavy coat. "Got news from up the mountain," he announced, looking directly at Sarah. "About your father." Sarah's heart stopped beating for a moment. She could tell from Morrison's expression that the news wasn't good. "What happened?" she whispered. Morrison pulled off his gloves and blew on his hands. "Avalanche hit the main road 3 days ago. Your father's wagon was caught in it." He paused, seeing the color drain from Sarah's face. "He's alive, but he's hurt bad. Broke his leg and maybe some ribs. The mine doctor is taking care of him, but he won't be traveling anywhere for weeks, maybe months." The silence in the trading post was so complete that Sarah could hear the wind whistling through the roof. She felt like the floor had dropped out from under her. "What about the money?" Webb asked, his voice cutting through Sarah's shock. "Did he deliver the furniture? Did he get paid?" Morrison shook his head. "Wagon was smashed to pieces, all the furniture destroyed, and the mine owner, well, he says no delivery means no payment." Webb's face grew dark as a storm cloud. Sarah watched him calculate numbers in his head, his lips moving silently. She knew what he was thinking. Without payment from the mine job, the Chen family had no way to pay their debt. And in Bitter Creek, Marcus Webb didn't let debts go unpaid. "That leaves us with a problem," Webb said slowly. $237.68 to be exact, plus interest. "Please, Mr. Webb," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Papa gets better, he can make more furniture. He's the best carpenter in 3 counties. You know he's good for the money. Webb walked around the counter and stood in front of Sarah. He was a big man, tall and broad-shouldered, and he used his size to intimidate people who owed him money. Your father has been saying he's good for the money for 6 months now, Webb said. And look where that got us. The debt keeps growing and now there's no way to pay it. What are you saying? Sarah asked, though part of her already knew. Webb smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I'm saying that debt needs to be paid one way or another. If your father can't work and you have no money, then we need to find another arrangement. Tom Morrison shifted uncomfortably near the door. Now, hold on, Marcus. The girl's got no part in this. The girl is part of the Chen family, Webb replied, not taking his eyes off Sarah. And the Chen family owes me money. There's an old law in this territory about debt settlement. When a debtor can't pay, family members can work off the debt. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. She had heard whispers of such arrangements, though they were becoming rare as the territory became more civilized. But in remote places like Bitter Creek, old laws and old ways still held power. You can't be serious, Morrison said. Webb pulled a worn legal document from behind the counter. Territorial Law, Section 47. A creditor may accept labor in lieu of monetary payment, with terms to be negotiated between parties. The girl can work off her family's debt. What kind of work? Sarah asked, though she dreaded the answer. Cleaning, cooking, general labor around the store, maybe helping in my house. My wife could use the help, especially with her being poorly lately. Webb's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the price of flour. Sarah's mind raced. She knew what this really meant. Once she was working for Webb to pay off the debt, she would essentially be his property until the money was earned. At the wages he would pay her, it could take years. How much would I earn? She asked. Webb pretended to think. Oh, say 50 cents a day? Plus room and board. That's generous for a girl with no experience. Sarah did the math quickly. At 50 cents a day, it would take more than a year of work just to pay off the current debt, and that didn't account for the interest Webb would continue to add. It was barely disguised slavery. I need time to think, Sarah said. Webb shook his head. No time for thinking. The debt is due now. Your father's accident doesn't change that. You can start today, or I can have the sheriff seize what little property your family has. Then you'll be working for me anyway, and your father will come home to nothing. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah knew Webb had the legal authority to do exactly what he said. Sheriff Blake was a friend of Webb's, and he would follow the territorial laws whether he liked them or not. Tom Morrison stepped forward. Marcus, this isn't right. Chen Wei is hurt, and the girl's got no family to speak for her. Can't you give them some time? Webb's expression grew ugly. Tom, this is business. I've got my own debts to pay, and I can't carry every hard-luck case in town. The girl works, or the family loses everything. Those are the choices. Sarah looked around the trading post, at the shelves full of goods that her family could never afford, at the warm stove that heated Webb's business, while her own home stayed cold. She thought about her father lying hurt in a mountain cabin, depending on her to somehow save their family from ruin. If I work for you, she said slowly, what guarantee do I have that you'll treat the arrangement fairly? How do I know you won't just keep adding charges and keep me working forever? Webb smiled again. You have my word as a businessman. The work will be honest, and the accounting will be fair. But Sarah could see the lie in his eyes. She knew that once she agreed to this arrangement, Webb would have all the power. He could charge her for her food, her lodging, her work clothes. He could add interest and fees until the debt never seemed to get smaller. I want it in writing, she said. A contract that says exactly how much I owe and how much I'll earn. And I want someone else to witness it. Webb's smile faltered. He hadn't expected her to be smart about the business side of the arrangement. That's That could be arranged, I suppose. Tom Morrison nodded approvingly. Good thinking, girl. If you're going to do this, you need legal protection. Webb pulled out a piece of paper and began writing. Sarah watched him carefully, knowing that every word on that contract would determine the next months or years of her life. When he finished, he slid the paper across the counter. Sarah read it slowly. The terms were harsh but clear. She would work 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, for 50 cents daily. Room and board would be provided without charge. The debt amount was fixed at $237.68, with no additional interest to be added once the contract was signed. It wasn't a good deal, but it was better than what Webb had originally planned. At least she would have some legal protection. I want one change, Sarah said. If my father recovers and can resume work, he should be allowed to make payments against the debt to reduce my time of service. Webb frowned, but Tom Morrison nodded. That's only fair, Marcus. With obvious reluctance, Webb added the clause to the contract. Sarah signed her name at the bottom, her hand shaking slightly. Tom Morrison signed as a witness, his face grim. When do I start? Sarah asked. Right now, Webb said. Get your things from home and be back here by evening. You'll sleep in the room above the store. As Sarah walked home through the blowing snow, she felt like she was walking to her own funeral. The small cabin she had shared with her father looked cold and empty, as if it already knew she was leaving. She packed her few belongings into a cloth bag and wrote a letter to her father, explaining what had happened and assuring him that everything would be all right. But as she walked back to the trading post that evening, she wondered if she would ever see her freedom again. The snow continued to fall, covering the town in white silence, and Sarah felt like she was disappearing beneath it. Webb met her at the door of the store, his expression businesslike. Your room is upstairs. Work starts at 5 in the morning. Don't be late. The room was small and cold, with a narrow bed and a single window that looked out over the main street. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at the snow-covered town below. Somewhere out there, in the vast white wilderness, her father was lying hurt and helpless. And somewhere else, perhaps riding through the same snow, someone might be coming to help them. But for now, she was alone, and she was trapped. The wind howled outside her window like a living thing, and Sarah pulled her thin blanket around her shoulders and tried not to cry. Tomorrow would bring its own troubles, and she would need all her strength to face them. The trading post grew quiet as the night deepened, but Sarah remained awake, staring out at the endless snow and wondering if spring would ever come again. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah Chen began working for Marcus Webb, and each day felt longer than the last. Her hands were raw from scrubbing floors and washing dishes, and her back ached from carrying heavy sacks of grain and flour. Webb worked her from dawn until well past dark, and she barely had enough energy to collapse into her narrow bed each night. The worst part wasn't the physical labor, though. It was the way Webb looked at her when he thought no one was watching. There was something hungry in his eyes that made her skin crawl, and she had started barricading her door at night with a chair pushed under the handle. On this particular morning, Sarah was sweeping the front porch of the trading post when she heard the distant sound of horse hooves on the frozen ground. She looked up to see a lone rider approaching through the swirling snow. The figure was bundled in a heavy coat and had a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, but even from a distance, she could tell he rode with the easy confidence of someone who lived in the saddle. Behind him, on a lead rope, he pulled a pack horse loaded with supplies. As he drew closer, Sarah could see that his coat was well made but worn, and his boots had the scuffed look of a working man. Most interesting of all, she noticed a small bundle secured carefully in front of his saddle. The rider stopped in front of the trading post and dismounted with fluid grace. As he turned to tie his horses to the hitching post, Sarah caught a glimpse of his face. He was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and steady brown eyes. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but there was a gentleness around his mouth that spoke of a man who smiled often. "Morning, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat politely. His voice carried a slight accent that Sarah couldn't quite place. "Good morning, sir," Sarah replied. "Are you looking for supplies?" The man glanced at the sign over the trading post door, then back at Sarah. "Actually, I'm looking for information. I'm trying to find a man named Marcus Webb." Something in his tone made Sarah's heart skip. There was a careful control in his voice that suggested strong feelings held in check. "Mr. Webb is inside," Sarah said. "But may I ask what business you have with him?" The stranger studied her for a moment as if weighing how much to tell her. "My name is Daniel Reeves. I've come a long way to settle a debt." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, the small bundle in his saddle began to move. To her amazement, a tiny face peeked out from the fur-lined wrapping. It was a baby, no more than a few months old, with bright blue eyes and a button nose red from the cold. "Oh my," Sarah breathed. "You've brought a baby on this journey?" Daniel's expression softened as he looked at the child. "This is my daughter, Emma. I go where she goes, and she goes where I go. We don't have anyone else." The simple statement carried a weight of sadness that made Sarah's chest tight. She recognized the look of someone who had lost everything important except for one precious thing they would protect at any cost. "It's bitter cold out here for such a little one," Sarah said. "Would you like to bring her inside where it's warm?" Daniel nodded gratefully. "That would be kind of you." He carefully lifted the baby from the saddle, cradling her with the practiced ease of a man who had been caring for her alone for some time. Emma was bundled in what looked like expensive furs, and Sarah could see that despite their long journey, both father and daughter were well cared for. They walked into the trading post together, and Sarah immediately saw Webb look up from his ledger with the calculating expression he always wore when potential customers entered his store. "Welcome to Webb's trading post," Marcus said, standing up behind the counter. "What can I do for you?" Daniel approached the counter slowly, his daughter held protectively against his chest. "Are you Marcus Webb?" "I am. And you are?" "Daniel Reeves." He paused, letting the name hang in the air. "I believe you knew my wife, Catherine Reeves." The change in Webb's expression was immediate and dramatic. His face went white, then flushed red, and his hands gripped the edge of the counter so hard his knuckles showed white. I haven't heard that name in some time," Webb stammered. "I'm sure you haven't," Daniel said, his voice remaining calm but somehow becoming more dangerous. "It's been 8 months since she died giving birth to this little girl. 8 months since I learned about the business arrangement you forced on her." Sarah felt the tension in the room like electricity before a lightning strike. She looked between the two men, trying to understand what was happening. Webb seemed to have forgotten she was there, his attention focused entirely on Daniel and the baby. "I don't know what lies you've been told," Webb said, his voice gaining strength as he found his footing. "But any business I had with your wife was legal and proper." Daniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Legal, perhaps. Proper is a different question entirely." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This is a copy of the contract you made my wife sign. The one where she agreed to work off her family's debt by providing personal services." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah felt her stomach turn as she began to understand what kind of man Webb really was. "Personal services?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel glanced at her, then back at Webb. "My wife's family owed this man money. When they couldn't pay, he forced her into an arrangement where she had to compromise herself to work off the debt. She was 17 years old." Sarah's knees nearly buckled. Webb had done this before. The way he looked at her, the suggestions he had been making about extra work at his house, the door she barricaded every night, it was all part of a pattern. "Now see here," Webb blustered. "Your wife was a grown woman who made her own choices. If she told you different, she was lying to make herself look good." Daniel's control slipped for just a moment, and Sarah saw the fury burning in his eyes. "My wife never lied about anything. When she was dying, she made me promise to make sure you never did to another girl what you did to her." "You can't prove anything," Webb said, but his voice was shaking now. "And even if you could, it's ancient history. Your wife is dead, and there's nothing you can do about any of it now." Daniel looked around the trading post, his gaze taking in the well-stocked shelves and expensive fixtures. "You've done well for yourself, Webb. Built up quite a business on the backs of desperate families." "I run a legitimate business," Webb insisted. "Do you?" Daniel asked. "What about this girl?" He nodded towards Sarah. "How exactly is she working off her family's debt?" Webb's face grew ugly. "That's none of your business, stranger. Sarah's arrangement is between her and me." "Sarah," Daniel said, speaking directly to her, "how long have you been working here?" "3 weeks," Sarah replied, her voice stronger than she expected. "And how much have you earned toward paying off your debt?" Sarah looked at Webb, who was glaring at her with undisguised threat. But something about Daniel's presence made her feel braver. "At 50 cents a day, I should have earned $10.50. "And how much has been credited to your account?" Sarah hesitated. She knew the answer, but saying it out loud would make Webb's cheating obvious. "Answer him," Daniel said gently. "You have nothing to fear." "Nothing," Sarah whispered. "Mr. Webb says my room and board costs more than I earn, so nothing has been credited to the debt." Daniel nodded as if he had expected that answer. "In other words, you're working for free, and your debt is never getting smaller." "That's a damn lie," Webb shouted. "The girl eats food and sleeps under my roof. That costs money." "How much?" Daniel asked. "What? How much do you charge her for room and board? Show me the accounting." Webb opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. Sarah realized he had never kept any real accounting of her costs because he had never intended to let her work off the debt. Daniel shifted his daughter to one arm and reached into his coat again. This time he pulled out a leather wallet thick with paper money. "Let's settle this right now," he said. "How much does the Chen family owe you?" $237.68, Webb said automatically, then seemed to regret giving the exact amount. Daniel began counting out bills on the counter. "And how much has Sarah earned in 3 weeks of work?" Webb didn't answer, so Daniel continued counting. "At 50 cents a day, 6 days a week for 3 weeks, that's $9. So the current debt is $228.68. He placed exactly that amount on the counter. "There. The debt is paid in full." Webb stared at the money as if it were a coiled snake. "I can't accept payment from you. The debt belongs to the Chen family." "Sarah is part of the Chen family," Daniel replied, "and I'm acting as her agent in this transaction. Unless you're claiming her labor agreement isn't legitimate." It was a clever trap. If Webb admitted the labor arrangement was illegitimate, he would be confessing to illegal debt bondage. If he claimed it was legitimate, then Sarah had the right to arrange payment through a third party. "The money is all there," Daniel continued. "Count it if you want. Sarah's debt is paid and her contract is void." Webb's hands hovered over the money, but he didn't touch it. "Who the hell are you anyway? And where did you get this kind of money?" "I told you who I am. As for the money, let's just say my late wife's family was more generous in death than they ever were in life. Catherine's father left her quite an inheritance, which passed to me when she died." "So you're some kind of rich man playing hero?" Daniel's expression hardened. I'm a father trying to keep a promise to his dying wife, and I'm a man who doesn't like seeing young women taken advantage of by predators." The word predator hung in the air like an accusation. Webb's face flushed red with anger. "Get out of my store," he snarled. "Take your money and your bastard child and get out." The insult about the baby was too much. Daniel stepped forward and Webb instinctively stepped back. "Be very careful," Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. "That little girl is the most precious thing in my world, and I don't take kindly to anyone speaking ill of her." Webb seemed to realize he had crossed a line. He looked around his store as if seeing it clearly for the first time, taking in Sarah's shocked face and the money sitting on his counter. "Fine," he said finally. "Take the girl. But don't think this is over. I have friends in this town and I have influence. You're making a mistake crossing me." Daniel smiled coldly. "I've crossed worse men than you and lived to tell about it. Sarah, get your things. You're leaving with us." Sarah looked between the two men, hardly daring to believe what was happening. After 3 weeks of despair, freedom was being offered to her by a complete stranger. "Where will I go?" she asked. "That depends," Daniel said. "Do you have any skills besides cleaning floors?" "I can read and write. I helped my father with his carpentry business, keeping books and dealing with customers. And I'm good with numbers." Daniel nodded approvingly. "I'm heading to California to start fresh. There are opportunities there for people willing to work hard. You could come with us if you want. Help me care for Emma and perhaps start a business of our own." It was more hope than Sarah had dared to imagine. She looked at Webb one last time, seeing him clearly for the small, vicious man he really was. "I'll get my things," she said. As she climbed the stairs to her tiny room, Sarah heard Webb behind her, muttering threats and curses. But his words couldn't touch her now. She was free, and she had a future again. When she came back down with her small bundle of belongings, Daniel was still standing by the counter, his daughter sleeping peacefully in his arms. The money was gone, and Webb was nowhere to be seen. "Ready?" Daniel asked. Sarah nodded, then hesitated. "Mr. Reeves, why did you really come here? It wasn't just to settle my debt, was it?" Daniel looked toward the back of the store, where they could hear Webb moving around in his office. "No, it wasn't, but that's a conversation for the road. Right now, we need to get out of this town before Webb decides to cause more trouble." They walked out of the trading post together, and Sarah felt like she was walking out of a nightmare into the beginning of a dream. The snow was still falling, but somehow it looked beautiful now instead of threatening. As Daniel helped her mount one of his horses, Sarah looked back at the trading post one last time. In the window, she could see Webb watching them leave, his face twisted with fury and defeat. "Don't look back," Daniel said gently. "That part of your life is over now." Sarah turned her face toward the road ahead, toward California, and whatever new life awaited them there. Behind them, Bitter Creek disappeared into the swirling snow, and Sarah felt like she was finally breathing freely for the first time in weeks. The small campfire crackled in the circle of stones Daniel had carefully arranged, its warm light pushing back the darkness of the Colorado wilderness. They had been traveling for 5 days since leaving Bitter Creek, and each mile had taken them further from the snow-covered mountains toward the promise of warmer weather ahead. Sarah sat across the fire from Daniel, watching him feed his daughter with the patient care of a man who had learned to be both father and mother to his child. Emma gurgled happily as she drank from her bottle, her tiny hands reaching up to touch her father's face. "She's beautiful," Sarah said softly. "She has your eyes, but I think her smile is all her own." Daniel smiled at that. The first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him since they met. Catherine always said Emma would have her own way of looking at the world. Even before she was born, she was stubborn and independent. It was the first time Daniel had spoken his wife's name without pain shadowing his features. Sarah had learned to read the subtle changes in his expression during their days of travel. He was a man who felt things deeply, but kept those feelings carefully controlled. "Will you tell me about her?" Sarah asked. "About Catherine?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, settling Emma more comfortably in his arms. The fire popped and sent sparks dancing up into the star-filled sky. "She was 19 when I met her," he said finally. "I was working a cattle drive through Kansas, and she was working in a restaurant in Abilene. Smartest woman I ever met, and the kindest. She could make anyone feel like they mattered." "How did she end up in debt to Webb?" Daniel's expression darkened. "Her father was a gambler who thought he was smarter than he actually was. When Catherine was 17, he borrowed money from Webb to cover gambling debts, using the family farm as collateral. When he couldn't pay, Webb foreclosed on the farm and offered Catherine a way to earn it back." Sarah felt her stomach twist. "The same arrangement he tried with me." "Exactly. Except Catherine was alone and desperate. Her mother had died years before, and her father had drunk himself to death shortly after losing the farm. She had nowhere else to go." "So she agreed to Webb's terms?" Daniel nodded, his jaw tight with old anger. "She worked for him for 2 years, Sarah. 2 years of being treated like property, of having to accommodate his demands. She never told me the details, and I never pushed her to. But I saw what it did to her. She was ashamed of things that were never her fault." Sarah stared into the fire, trying to imagine the courage it must have taken for Catherine to survive those years. "How did she get away from him?" "Webb got careless. He made the mistake of trying to cheat a cattle buyer who had connections with the territorial marshal. When they investigated Webb's business, they found irregularities in his labor contracts. Catherine was able to leave, but not before Webb had stolen 2 years of her life." "And you met her after that?" 6 months later. She was working in that restaurant, trying to build a new life. It took me a year to convince her to trust me enough to marry me." Daniel's voice grew soft with memory. "She said she was damaged goods. I told her that anyone who could survive what she'd survived and still find the strength to be kind to strangers was the strongest person I'd ever met." Emma had fallen asleep in Daniel's arms, her small face peaceful in the firelight. He looked down at her with such love that Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "She died because of complications from the birth," Daniel continued. "The doctor said it sometimes happens with women who have been through severe stress. Her body just couldn't handle bringing Emma into the world." "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered. The worst part was that she blamed herself. Even at the end, she was apologizing to me for not being strong enough to live. "She made me promise to find Webb and make sure he never did to another girl what he did to her." Sarah understood now why Daniel had traveled so far with a baby to find Webb. It wasn't just about justice. It was about keeping a promise to the woman he loved. "When I heard about your situation from Tom Morrison, I knew I had found what Catherine was talking about," Daniel said. "Morrison had been asking around neighboring towns about Webb, trying to find someone who might help you. Word travels fast in small communities." "Tom Morrison was looking for help for me?" Daniel nodded. "He's a good man who was horrified by what Webb was doing to you, but he's also an old man with no money and no power. He needed someone who could stand up to Webb." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude for the gruff messenger who had brought news of her father's accident. She had thought he was just being nosy, but he had actually been trying to help her. "What will happen to Webb now?" she asked. Daniel's smile was grim. "I sent a telegram to the territorial marshal before we left Bitter Creek, along with copies of Catherine's original contract and your contract. I think Mr. Webb is going to find himself answering some difficult questions very soon." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the wilderness around them. Sarah had never felt so safe, despite being miles from civilization. There was something about Daniel's steady presence that made her believe everything would work out. "What will I do when we reach California?" Sarah asked. "I can't just take Charity from you forever." Daniel shifted Emma to his shoulder and began patting her back gently. "I wasn't thinking of it as charity. I was thinking of it as a partnership." "What kind of partnership?" "I have money from Catherine's inheritance, but I don't have business sense. You have education and experience keeping books and dealing with customers. I'm thinking we could start a trading company, buy goods in one place, sell them in another. California is growing fast, and there are opportunities for people willing to work hard and think smart." Sarah felt a flutter of excitement. It was exactly the kind of challenge she would love to take on. "What about Emma?" she asked. "A trading company would mean travel. And she's still so small." Daniel looked down at his sleeping daughter. "Emma comes with us wherever we go. I won't leave her with strangers, and I won't send her away to school until she's old enough to understand why. She's all I have left of Catherine." "It won't be easy, traveling with a baby." "Nothing worthwhile is easy," Daniel replied. "But between the two of us, I think we can manage. You're good with her already, and she seems to like you." It was true. Over the past 5 days, Sarah had found herself naturally helping with Emma's care. She had a gentle touch with the baby, and Emma seemed to calm down faster when Sarah held her. "There's something else," Daniel said, his voice becoming more serious. "I want you to know that this partnership would be exactly that, a business arrangement between equals. You don't owe me anything, and I won't expect anything from you except honest work and fair dealing." Sarah understood what he was telling her. He was making it clear that he wasn't another Marcus Webb, that she would be safe with him and free to make her own choices. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like it very much." Daniel smiled. "Good. We can work out the details as we go. For now, we should get some sleep. We have a long day ahead of us tomorrow." As they banked the fire and prepared their bedrolls, Sarah looked up at the stars scattered across the vast sky. 3 weeks ago, she had thought her life was over. Now she was traveling toward a new future with people who cared about her. "Daniel," she said into the darkness, "why did you really help me? It wasn't just about keeping your promise to Catherine, was it?" There was a long pause before he answered. "When I saw you in that trading post, you reminded me of Catherine when I first met her. You had the same look in your eyes, hurt but not broken, afraid but still fighting. I couldn't save Catherine from what happened to her, but I could save you from the same fate." "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "Thank you for helping me keep my promise to her. I think Catherine would have liked you." Sarah fell asleep that night listening to the gentle sounds of Daniel settling Emma for the night. For the first time in months, she dreamed of something other than debt and desperation. She dreamed of a trading post of her own, with shelves full of goods and customers who came because they trusted her to deal with them fairly. She dreamed of a future where she was the one making decisions about her own life. When she woke the next morning, Daniel already had coffee brewing and was feeding Emma her breakfast bottle. The baby was wide awake and alert, looking around at the world with bright, curious eyes. "Good morning," Daniel said. "Ready for another day of adventure?" Sarah stretched and stood up, feeling stronger and more hopeful than she had in a long time. "Ready." As they packed their camp and prepared to continue their journey, Sarah realized that she wasn't just traveling toward California. She was traveling toward the person she was meant to be. Marcus Webb had tried to steal her future, but he had failed. Her real life was just beginning. 3 months later, Sarah stood on the loading dock of Chen & Reeves Trading Company in Sacramento, California, checking inventory against the manifest of a ship that had just arrived from San Francisco. Business was booming, and they were already planning to open a second location in Los Angeles. Daniel walked up carrying Emma, who was now sitting up on her own and babbling constantly. The baby had thrived during the journey west, and she clearly loved being the center of attention in their busy trading post. "How did we do?" Daniel asked, nodding toward the ship. Sarah smiled and showed him the ledger. "Better than expected. The silk sold out completely, and we have orders for twice as much next month." "And the lumber contracts?" "Signed and delivered. The railroad crews will take everything we can supply them." Daniel looked out over their growing business with satisfaction. "Catherine would be proud of what we've built here." Sarah followed his gaze. Through the window of their office, she could see their dozen employees loading and unloading wagons, their customers examining goods, and their accountant working on the books. It was everything she had dreamed of and more. "I received a letter today," Sarah said, pulling an envelope from her apron pocket. "From Tom Morrison." "News from Bitter Creek?" Sarah nodded. "Webb was arrested by the territorial marshal 2 weeks ago. They found evidence of illegal labor contracts going back more than 10 years. He's facing federal charges." Daniel's expression grew grim with satisfaction. "Good. What about the other girls he victimized?" "Morrison says the federal prosecutor is trying to find them and offer compensation. Apparently, Webb's assets are being seized to pay damages." Emma chose that moment to reach for Sarah, making happy baby sounds. Sarah took her from Daniel and settled her on her hip, where Emma immediately began playing with the buttons on Sarah's dress. "You know," Daniel said, watching them together, "I never thanked you properly for everything you've done for Emma. She loves you like a second mother." Sarah felt her chest tighten with emotion. Over the months of travel and building their business, she had grown to love Emma as if the baby were her own daughter. And Daniel. Well, Daniel had become something she hadn't dared to hope for. A true partner, someone who respected her mind and valued her contributions. "Daniel," she said carefully, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her with concern. "What is it?" "I received another letter today from my father. He's recovered from his injuries and wants me to come home." Daniel's face went very still. "And what did you tell him?" Sarah looked around at their thriving business, at Emma playing happily in her arms, at Daniel, whose steady presence had become the foundation of her new life. "I told him that I am home," she said. "Right here, with my family." Daniel's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Are you sure? I know how much you missed him during his recovery. I'm sure. He'll always be my father, and I'll always love him. But my life is here now, with you and Emma and everything we've built together." Daniel reached over and gently touched Emma's cheek, then looked into Sarah's eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that. Because I can't imagine our life without you in it." As the sun set over the busy Sacramento waterfront, Sarah realized that her journey from debt slavery to freedom had led her to something she had never expected to find. A family of her own choosing, a business built on honest work and fair dealing, and a future limited only by her own dreams and determination. The snow-covered town of Bitter Creek seemed like something from another lifetime, a bad dream that had somehow led to the best thing that ever happened to her. Marcus Webb had tried to steal her future, but in the end, he had inadvertently led her to the life she was meant to live. Emma gurgled and reached up to touch Sarah's face with tiny fingers, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged.